Hello and welcome to the April Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring the chat box today, and we'll be adding housekeeping items there. These monthly forums feature research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early child care and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Fashina Aladé. Dr. Aladé is an assistant professor in the departments of advertising and public relations and human development and family studies at Michigan State University. Her research focuses at the intersection of media effects, early childhood education, and developmental psychology. Specifically, Dr. Aladé explores how young children acquire knowledge from educational media and is deeply passionate about ensuring that her research findings reach the people who need it most: parents, educators, and children's media creators. Dr. Aladé also collaborates with various media companies and television stations to assess the efficacy of children's TV programs and online games. Her work has garnered top awards from the International Communication Association, has been featured in numerous well-regarded journals. Dr. Aladé will discuss her recent research today, which delves into the representation of race and gender in STEM-based children's TV programs. She will also be sharing insights gleaned from her interview study with parents and children, exploring what features of STEM TV shows resonate as culturally inclusive and authentic. I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Aladé.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorr, for the warm introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm really glad to be able to speak with a wide audience today and share a bit of recent work. And so let me go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see if I can do this smoothly. Always that's always the catch on these. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna assume that that's working and note that someone will tell me if anything's wrong. Thank you, Dr. Dorr. Okay, so I am going to start us off with just a little bit of an overview of sort of big picture. Why are we talking about children in media before I sort of narrow in on focusing on today's topic of who's modeling STEM. So I do want to take a moment to zoom out and talk about, in case there are any folks in the room in the on the webinar today who maybe aren't spending that much time yet thinking about kids in media, although these days that's increasingly rare, right? So that I do sometimes, give the anecdote that studying this intersection used to be a sort of rare and novel concept to talk about with folks. And then the pandemic came around and suddenly everyone was talking about children and screens, and right, because they were really using it at far more rates than ever before. And so maybe I don't have to convince you that this is an important area, but I'll just sort of go over a little bit of that background information. Right, of course, we know children are spending a lot of time with screens, right? This has been increasingly so over the last decade or so. And as I mentioned, has become even more of an issue that causes some concern, some valid concern, but I think also challenges us to think in really critical ways about, what does that mean? And hopefully causes some of us to say, okay, these screens aren't going anywhere, so what can we do about it? We do know that because children's young brains are still rapidly developing, they are more susceptible to media effects, as we tend to call them in sort of my background field of communication, media psychology. And so certainly there are a lot of documented negative effects of sort of overuse of screen time, or various ways of talking about that issue. And we've seen that documented over the decades. Areas like violence and aggression, antisocial behavior. We see some evidence of delayed cognitive development, attention disorders, again, especially when we get into the realm of overuse. Now, my running professional joke is too strong of a word, but I like to say that I'm so grateful to have brilliant colleagues who study these negative effects so that I get to focus on what for me is the more fun part of looking at positive effects of children's media use. And so likewise, we have several decades of research and scholarship that do show that when children's media use is done in age appropriate and developmentally appropriate ways, and when media is designed from a developmental age appropriate perspective and backed by research, that we can see lots of positive effects, right? And so ranging from academic achievement, pro-social behavior, increased vocabulary, literacy, numeracy, school readiness, that there is strong evidence that media can have these positive effects, right? And so this is really why I got into the field that I am in, why I got do the research that I do, inspired by early work that really started with Sesame Street, which maybe we have some Sesame fans in the audience today. Started doing a lot of that early work on looking at how media could have these positive educational pro-social effects on kids. And so generally in my research as a whole, I sort of have these two guiding research questions of thinking about how do children learn from and respond to the media that they use and consume? And then importantly, how can we use that understanding to create better, more enriching, more effective programming for young kids? So that's my quick background, big picture, zoom out. And then I will go ahead and segue into today's focus, which is narrowing in on this idea of, given that we know kids can and do learn from screens, a few years ago, I started really gaining some interest in the topic of who are they learning from, right? And especially given the recent rise in STEM-focused educational media for kids, thinking about if that media has the intended effect, is it having the intended effect on the audiences we hope it might, right? And especially thinking about this for all children, right? So for, well, let me not get ahead of myself. And so there's I have more slides on this, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Okay, why am I focused on STEM? Certainly, I think educational media should be culturally relevant to kids, no matter what the topic is. But we do see some sort of national interest in broadening participation in STEM. There's many of you, again, this is probably, these are stats that you've probably heard before, but we are in an increasingly STEM-focused global workforce, especially here within the United States. There's a lot of pressure, motivation for us to compete in STEM at a global level, continuing to do that and perhaps doing it better than we have been in previous years. We have seen that some studies have shown that children in the US have less interest in STEM than some of our international and industrialized peer nations. And so big push for this. And further, we have seen historically that we don't have sort of equal, equitable participation in STEM, right? And there are a variety of reasons and systemic barriers that contribute to these inequalities. And I won't focus on that in my talk today, but suffice to say, we do see very few people of color, particularly women of color and women in general, in STEM fields, right? Their representation is much less than you'd expect by looking at our sort of general diverse population that we have in this country. And so, right, generally speaking, we are seeing a national effort towards broadening participation in STEM among children of color and girls, and a lot of different efforts to increase that interest and participation. I'll go on and say, now, thinking about media and television specifically. I should say that for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on television as sort of the educational medium of interest here, but we could certainly talk about media more broadly. And some of my work does also look at interactive media, apps, games, things like that. And so I'll be happy to take any questions on that, perhaps in the Q&A section. But for now, focusing on TV, because it is the most widely reaching medium. And even though as adults, our TV use, TV watching has sort of decreased in the last couple of decades, for young kids especially, we know that TV is still the primary sort of screen that they are using. And now TV can mean lots of different things. So it's certainly not just traditional network and network cable broadcast viewing, right? TV, for the purposes of this talk, means any sort of video viewing that may be happening over streaming services, happening in a screen the size of your hand or a tablet sized, or on a traditional TV as we might think of it. Okay, so thinking about this intersection of television use, representation, and this STEM participation, right? TV historically has been suggested and in some ways evidenced to be sort of part of the problem as far as lack of representation in STEM careers and in professional careers in general for women and people of color. Women and people of color are consistently underrepresented overall in the media. And then especially when you look at characters who hold professional occupations, occupations that would be considered, in highly regarded and that are shown as highly regarded in television. These are overwhelmingly male characters and white characters. And there are theories coming from sort of the media effects world that suggest that long-time exposure to these stereotypical portrayals does indeed affect the way that individuals see and view the world around them. Right. Now, we know this is not necessarily a one-directional relationship. TV is not the only one to blame, right? TV we could think of as sort of a mirror that reflects our society, but sort of the way the parts that it reflects tend to be reinforced in our worldview. And so there's a good amount of documentation, for example, that very heavy television viewers tend to see the world as more violent, and tend to adhere to more traditional stereotypes in a lot of different domains. That said, so historical landscape in mind, we also know that television can be part of the solution. As I mentioned earlier, policymakers have called for more creative solutions to encourage and broaden participation in STEM. And educational TV is one type of informal education that can encourage positive attitudes towards different academic subjects. Especially when we talk about math and science, we find studies have shown that parents look to educational TV as a way to expose their kids to science and math, areas where they may feel a bit less equipped to be their child's teacher. Right. And so I'm going to draw that out a bit more compared to areas like literacy. Many parents feel very comfortable reading to their children and sort of maybe helping them spell out words and things like that. But when it comes to sort of science and math topics, we find that many parents lack confidence in their own ability to sort of be their child's teacher or educator on those topics. And so they often turn to media, whether that's showing their child a YouTube video to explain a phenomenon, something that happens with the weather or in nature and science. This is a really common tactic for parents of young and older children. And so I lost my mouse. Okay, so we have, again, this knowledge that parents are turning to educational media, STEM-focused media, to help their children in those areas. This brought me to sort of my main research questions that I'll be focusing on today in thinking about who are they learning from? We know that modeling is a really important way that kids learn from educational media, right? It's not only about the content that's taught or what they hear or the lessons that are included, but it's specifically the relationship they have sort of with the characters that they love and watch, and how those characters behave and what they do that can have some really powerful effects on child viewers. And so the research questions for this first study that I'm going to talk with you about were, how does representation of gender and race in STEM television shows for young children compare to the US population? Are there differences by gender or race in who models engagement in STEM learning in these shows? And I was also interested in what types of STEM occupations are depicted in these STEM shows for young children. And so this study that I'm going to present to you is what we call a content analysis, sort of in the media research world, where we are sort of taking a sample of whatever the medium is, in this case, educational TV shows for kids that focus on STEM learning, science, technology, engineering, and math, anything in that area. And looking at, again, this particular study was character focused. So who are the characters in these shows, and what are they doing on screen? What is it that kids are seeing modeled in these shows? So we went about this. We first looked at, I should say this data is now a couple of years old. This is the sample was developed in 2016. So there are, in fact, actually quite a few more STEM shows available to children today than there were in this study, but we were able to find 30 shows that focused on, again, anything related to that science, math, engineering, technology, that were geared towards the sort of preschool, kindergarten age range. So any show that said they were for kids between 3 and 6. And we looked at all shows, broadcast, cable, and streaming. So we pulled from Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, which were the primary streaming services at the time this data were collected, and looked at 3 episodes from a recent season of each of those shows. And I throw these pictures on just to make sure that hopefully you're all able to draw to mind what these shows might look like. And so for any of you in the audience today who maybe have young kids, maybe some of the shows here might be coming to mind when I'm talking about sort of STEM-focused educational TV shows. But for some of us who maybe don't have kids at home, you might be thinking like, what does this mean? What shows are focused on STEM? But there's quite a few shows that are sort of recently popular and recently developed. Sid the Science Kid is a really is one that often comes to mind for folks, that is very science focused and for young kids. These 4 shows were all in the sample: Thomas Edison's Secret Lab, Oz Squad, Androids. These are just a few examples. You may have others that come to mind as well. And so from each of those 3 episodes, 30 shows, 90 episodes we looked at, and we broke it down to see exactly who were the characters that were included in these episodes. And so we looked at over 1,000 characters, and the research team made notes of any character that came on screen in those episodes, whether they were a major character or a minor character, whether they had a speaking role or not, and looked at their gender, their race, their age, their role in the show. We looked at things, because this is children's often animated television. We looked at things like, are they human or non-human? We did look at things like hair color, eye color, some really sort of detailed coding here. And then so that's what we called these character attributes, basic descriptions of the character. And then we also looked at the character's actual behavior in the episodes, what we called these STEM participation variables. So we looked to see whether each character was involved in more active or more passive learning, whether they were teaching, whether they were making observations, asking questions, investigating, and problem solving. So these are sort of taking part in that scientific process, right? And I'll pause here just to say, right, why make sure that I'm making it very clear why we were looking at this STEM participation idea. You could imagine there could be a show that does a beautiful job of having very diverse characters and lots of great STEM content. But if amongst that diverse cast, if it were only and I'm just using the sort of more classic example here, if it were only the white male characters that were sort of really engaging in the STEM behavior, that were solving the problems and making hypotheses, right, while the more diverse characters were falling back and just listening or learning, right, we might think of that as a great example of where, okay, sure, there is diversity represented in this show, but when we look at who's doing that STEM work, who's modeling STEM engagement, then we could really see some differences here, right? So that's sort of the why behind why we were looking at these particular variables. I'm going to go ahead and share some of the results. What did we find after looking at these 30 episodes? And for these first couple slides, again, we're comparing to the US population. And that was a research decision that we made, right? One of the great questions that I love getting is like, why would that be the benchmark? And I love that question because it doesn't necessarily have to be the benchmark of comparison, but sort of we needed some benchmark, something to compare to. And so, my hope, and this is where you can, certainly my own bias is playing in, is that I would hope that in the world of where there are no sort of the world of animation, the world where sort of any character could be cast as anything, why not have it be at least equal to US population statistics? And so that's why sort of I chose that as the benchmark of comparison. So looking first at gender in these shows, we did see that male characters were overrepresented compared to the US population, right? So we are just about 50-50 in our population here, but within the sample, we saw that 60% of the characters were male and 40% were female. What was interesting, however, was that that gender difference actually disappeared when looking at only human child characters. So if you think about kids shows and the way they're often structured, there tend to be, a core set of usually child characters, and then there are often some adults around helping. So it was interesting, if you looked only at those sort of primary child characters, we actually saw that gender representation was quite equal. And it was only sort of that zoom out of all the characters where we still saw these imbalances. And so what does that mean to me, right? That suggests that producers are trying to think about gender equity when they are focused on sort of the central characters, but maybe not thinking about it when it comes to all of the side characters, the adult sort of helpers in the shows. This is a look at character role based on their gender. So we coded each character for whether they were sort of on the left, you'll see here a very minor character. They walk on and have very little contribution, all the way up to a real center protagonist. And what you can see here, so the green bars are female characters, blue bars are male characters. So what you can see is that for all of the we'll say less central to moderately central characters, things look roughly equal, or in fact, you may see even more female characters. But when we get here to the protagonists, we see this gender imbalance where now there are more male characters than female characters. So again, it's overall, maybe the picture's okay, but really thinking about the protagonists and who's doing the sort of central work of the show, we do see that more traditional imbalance. Okay, now turning to, we were also interested, again, this study was focused on race and gender. I should also note that these are sort of in some ways oversimplified descriptors. We did look for sort of non-binary characters, but there were very few in the sample. And certainly I acknowledge that racial categories are not a perfect way to measure someone's identity. And so I want to give that very important caveat, but for the sake of getting some description of what we're seeing, we are relying on some traditional racial category descriptors here. And so in this chart, you can see the darker blue bars are what we saw in the sample, and the lighter blue bars are the US population. And so what was interesting here, we sort of expected that there would be, based on content analyses of the past, we expected there would be more white characters than characters of color. And that wasn't exactly what we saw. So this is characters who were coded as white. And so actually they were sort of underrepresented slightly in the sample compared to the US population. And we saw a good number of Black characters compared to the US population. Not a lot of characters that had an Asian ethnicity or indigenous or mixed race, just a few in each of those categories, but it was somewhat equal to the US population. Where we saw quite a big discrepancy, this is our sort of Hispanic Latino characters who were coded as such, where that was much lower, this dark bar here, compared to the US population. And so I'm going to pause and give you a minute to sort of take this in and thinking about like, what's going on here, right? So we're seeing, it's not that white characters are overrepresented, but we are definitely seeing some underrepresentation of certain minoritized backgrounds. And when we dug at this a little bit deeper, sort of the main somewhat unexpected finding was what I've been referring to as the rise of the racially ambiguous character. There were many characters in our sample who might be referred to. There's some literature on sort of the browning or the tanning of sort of US culture. So this idea that these are characters that probably would not be recognized or identified as white, but also aren't necessarily representing a particular minoritized racial or cultural background. And so Sid the Science Kid is a great example that I like to point to, where indeed it looks like a diverse cast. The different characters that are sort of claymation-like figures do have sort of different hair types and different shades of pink and yellow and orange that, you know, as an adult, we probably can see and say, oh, I see they were looking to show some diversity. But it's not in any sort of human, authentically human way, right? And so this for me was one of the sort of most interesting findings of this research. I think what this means, and what I'll say now from more recent research of talking with folks who are creating content, is there is this effort to create more diverse characters, but there's also this sort of hesitation, right? And I think the idea behind this is that, oh, if we choose an ambiguously tan character, then perhaps many different types of children will relate to this character and see themselves as similar to the character. And, you know, I think that is a valid hypothesis. But there are many of us scholars that are really calling for more authentically inclusive representation. And so rather than this sort of ambiguous tan that we see, or the purple and pink and orange characters, really saying the next stage that it would be great to see sort of children's television get to is this authentic representation, that children from racially minoritized backgrounds in this country would more definitively see a character and say, yeah, yes, that character is like me. For the sake of time, I'm going to try to keep on moving here and talk for a moment about sort of what the STEM participation looked like. Overall, we did see fairly equal STEM participation by the characters, especially when they were child characters, but then this was not true at all when we looked at the adult characters. So these are a few examples of those STEM behaviors: active learning, questioning, and problem solving. Lighter bars here are the white adult characters, and the darker bars are adult characters who were representing a racially minoritized group. And this is where we do see some big discrepancies here, right? So just a lot more white characters that are really doing that STEM work, so that the adult characters that step in to explain to the children, well, here's how this works, right? We're sort of still adhering to the more traditional stereotypes. A quick look at what we saw when we were looking for STEM occupations that were portrayed in these shows. And again, I'll just back up here for a moment to say, why was this part of the research questions? If these shows are designed to increase participation in STEM, then we might argue, great, this is a wonderful way to expose children to occupations in STEM that they might not have access to in their everyday life, right? We actually, there's a lot of evidence that for when young children are, one of the best predictors of children sort of considering careers later in life is whether they had a model of that career early in their development. And that can be a real life model, right? A neighbor, a friend of the family, but can also be sort of these mediated role models that they might see in the media. And so we thought it was important to look at, these shows that are claiming to broaden participation in STEM. Are they showing STEM occupations? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no, not really. Of the occupations that were portrayed by any character in the sample, only 14% were STEM occupations. And so this really just seemed like a missed opportunity of these programs. And so I'm going to sort of just make sure I drive home a couple of takeaway points from this content analysis work. What did we sort of see from that? There's still some work needed to reach what we might call equitable representation in children's STEM television. But compared to some prior content analyses, compared to sort of historical research that has looked at the representation of race and gender in television, this work actually looked better certainly than what we've seen for mass audiences in prior decades. The lack of STEM occupation portrayals really does seem like a missed opportunity for early socialization of STEM interest, and especially that opportunity to have role models for children who may not have access to real life engineers, scientists, etc. And we're seeing producers answering this call for racial diversity with these more ambiguous characters, but there's very little research on whether or not that's an effective strategy for reaching children. And so I'm looking at time, and I'm just gonna strategize for a moment here, if you'll bear with me for just a second. Yes, okay. I think I have a few minutes to talk about sort of what's next. So there's some research showing that that these STEM portrayals may not have sort of the measurable impact that we hope that they might. And so a follow-up study that I did to the work that I just presented to you found where we talked with kids, we talked with kids before and after sort of this little media intervention, where we showed children a STEM educational show. In that study, we used Cyber Chase that had a nice diverse cast and had them watching a few episodes over the course of 8 weeks. And what we were looking to see was from the beginning of that to the end, would kids have more positive interest in STEM? Would they be, we measured on this sort of science and math interest assessment to see if that would be improved, and especially thinking about the relationships that the children had with characters. So we measured their science and math interest before and after the intervention, and we also measured sort of how much they liked the characters, how much they engaged with the characters that they watched over the 8 weeks of watching that show. And in a nutshell, what we found was when you looked at that sample overall, there really wasn't much change in their STEM interest. But if you looked specifically at the children who showed very high levels of, there's a term that we use called parasocial relationships or parasocial sort of interaction with the characters. And that term just means sort of this friendship-like relationship. And there's lots of work on parasocial relationships and parasocial interactions from sort of the fields of media effects, as well as sort of the children in media world. And if you could all maybe take a moment to think about a character that you feel some sense of connection with, and maybe that's one of your favorite characters from a show that you engage with, right? Maybe you have young kids at home who have a particular favorite show that they watch, and then they go to the playroom and sort of act out their favorite characters sort of with their toys, right? Things like that. So we talk about those as parasocial relationships. In the study, we saw that the kids who had developed that sort of strong relationship with characters in the shows, those were the children where we saw some positive gains in their interest in STEM over the course of watching the show. So we still need some more work to think about what drives those parasocial relationships. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is looking at trying to get a better understanding of children's perceptions of characters' race and thinking about how that changes throughout different stages of childhood and adolescence. So thinking more about that relationship between children's attitudes, which we think of as sort of their general liking or disliking of the content, thinking about their learning, thinking about their understanding of the episode, and how that relates to the character who's delivering that information. I will, let's see, I'm just in my last few moments here. I'm actually going to go ahead and stop sharing this slideshow and just speak with you for a few more minutes about a work in progress that's happening, where we are looking at the development of a new STEM show that also has a culture and inclusion focus. So this is a partnership with a PBS station that is building, they're in development of a new show, and they are really trying to sort of break the mold in how they're developing this show. And so in addition to having a great sort of STEM curriculum, which many PBS is great about including strong educational curricula in their programming, generally speaking. But the producers of this show, they were actually in early development back in the summer of 2020, and sort of in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, where as a country, we were really having conversations in lots of different domains. One of those domains was sort of the entertainment industry and talking about sort of the barriers to participation that exist for people of color, sort of getting into the media industry. And that being one of the reasons why we are still not seeing perhaps as many authentically diverse shows as we'd like to see in our entertainment world. And PBS being sort of forward thinking as they are, they were working on this new show, and I'll say, just because it's in early development, I will sort of not share specifics beyond that, but I hope that perhaps the next time I'm speaking with any of you, we'll be able to talk in more detail about it. They are sorry, all to say, thinking about, okay, how can we do this differently? We'd like to be sort of part of the change of developing better models for creating and breaking down some of those barriers to participation. And so this new show has a very intentional culture and inclusion focus, as well as a strong STEM curriculum. And so some of the work that I'm doing right now is looking at, what happens when that is a very strong focus that's baked in from the outset. And so I have some very early sort of findings. We've just wrapped up some interviews with parents and children, sort of seeing how they responded to some of those early episodes of the show. And what's been really interesting to see is that we're not seeing a lot from the children. And again, these are 3 to 6-year-olds, so they're quite young to be thinking. And we're also seeing especially that while they have strong gender identities at that age, their racial identities are very much still developing. And so we aren't necessarily seeing them recognize a lot of that content in the show. We are seeing parents really excited about this sort of culture and inclusion focus. We are finding that parents are noticing some of the small and nuanced ways that the show includes different values, different languages, different sort of cultural cues is the word that I'm using in this work to indicate right, that yes, this show is for you, it's for your family, and doing that for a broad audience. A few of the things parents have really sort of been excited to see are a focus on community. One of the things that came up in our interviews that especially for families of color, they were very excited about this show embracing the idea that kids grow up in a community, that it's not focused only on the nuclear family, parents and the children, and that for many, that especially for families of color, this aspect of community is really important, that kids are often, the old saying, it takes a village, right? Being raised maybe in sort of households that are not the traditional mom, dad, and 2 kids, right? That may be raised by grandparents, that may split time between different family members' houses. Having that represented has been something that's really resonating with parents. We are seeing a lot of interest and excitement in, this idea that, different types of families can be represented on screen. There is in one of the stories, we see sort of a single dad who's working from home, taking care of his child. And it's not what I think is really important and interesting to note here is it's not necessarily the central focus of the episode, but it is just sort of displayed as the norm. And that's something that we're finding that parents are really excited about, and there's a balance here because I think it is also important for there to be some explicit conversation about, what it means to come from these different backgrounds and to have these different perspectives, but that also that parents are excited to just see it there, seeing it presented as a totally normal thing that may not even need to be discussed, or certainly not in every episode. And so that's just sort of a snippet, again, of very early research that we've just started looking at some data on. But I think it is probably about time for me to go ahead and wrap up and take some Q&A. So I'll just lastly say that I, again, thank Dr. Dorr for having me today. And I'm very happy I'll look forward to the Q&A. And I skipped the slide where I put up my email address in case anyone wanted to contact me. But I'll find a way to, I think
drop that in the Q&A. Yeah, Kathy can pull that and drop it in the Q&A in the chat box for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Aladé. This is really interesting. We have some questions coming in the question and answer box, but audience, if you have additional questions for Dr. Aladé, please add those there. The first question that came in was, are the findings that you showed us today something you would expect in children's books as well? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I love that question. And I will give the caveat of saying that I have not directly studied this in children's books. But yes, we do see, and there's some great work that of course I'm not going to be able to pull the name off the top of my head, but that has looked at sort of who's represented in children's books. And we see very similar findings, and some work that has especially shown that there often when there are discussions about maybe differences or diversity, that in children's picture books, that typically is done with animal characters, or I should say often is done with animal characters. And so, yeah, we're seeing a sort of a similar trend of, right, there's some movement towards talking about these things and creating stories about differences and, even sometimes about biases and things like that. But it's still a very, very small percentage, both in books and media, that are actually having these conversations with human characters of, real different ethnicities and skin tones and things like that. So yes, so my limited understanding is that we see very similar trends in children's books. Yeah.
Thanks. Another question came in, so relating to what you're saying towards the end about parasocial relationships. And the question is, are children more likely to form parasocial attachments with characters who share similar demographic characteristics with themselves? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The short answer is sometimes, and we're still working on that. So that's one of the things that's really interesting to me, is thinking about what helps these parasocial relationships form and develop. And the research isn't super clear on this. There is some evidence that for some children that, yes, having sort of the gender matching or sort of physical feature matching does help. But also, kids are such fun and fascinating creatures that sometimes it's because I really like that character's shoes, right? Or I really like that he eats ice cream, and that's why he's my favorite character, right? So there's, so the answer is yes, there's some evidence that helps, but that it seems to be at interplay with a lot of other things as well. And so that's where it's one of the areas that I'm trying to sort of go in my future research, that I think we just don't quite have enough data on yet. Sort of, yeah, testing out that hypothesis of will showing more diverse characters really help more children to have those strong attachments and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Another question came in about challenges of some the implications of media research for show creators. So do you think there's any challenge for the creators of these shows to clearly represent minorities without being accused of stereotyping or insensitivity to some of these issues?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that question. That's a good invitation for me to talk about actually another aspect of the study that I was just ending on. In addition to looking at how parents and kids respond, we are actually also interviewing the creators of the show to sort of document this process of creating a STEM-focused show with this strong culture and inclusion focus. And it has been so interesting to speak to the creators and hear about sort of their challenges and what's going on. And so, yeah, absolutely, there are some challenges. There is, the nice thing for PBS is, of course, they aren't so worried about their, as public media, they aren't quite as concerned about dollars and their, bottom line. But they still do feel some pressure, right? Not to, there's two things that happen. I think on the one hand, some producers may feel some pressure sort of not to offend, not to do anything that might, that families in this country might find upsetting or not want their kids to see. And then there's also one of the interesting things was this sort of fear of doing it wrong, right? And so it's definitely something that needs to be done with careful intention, that show that that is in development has a whole set of sort of culture and inclusion advisors, where the creators are very careful to, if they are trying to write a storyline that's about a particular identity, if it's not the writer's own identity, that they talk to the advisors and make sure that they are writing the story in a way that is sort of, an authentic representation. And so I do think that that's a lot of sort of why we are seeing the leaning on the more ambiguous representation, is this sort of fear of doing it wrong, or of leaning on stereotypes. And I think that's definitely something that producers are right to be careful of, but that's part of why there is, right, this push to get more diverse writers behind the scenes, and more diverse creators of content. And so I think we're moving in that direction. But absolutely, it's tricky, right? And that's what I'm so kind of excited about in being able to do that interview work with the creators, is showing sort of the intricacies, the nuances of doing this, and how there are bound to be some mistakes made along the way, but that hopefully, these creators and future creators can learn from those sort of trials and errors.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'll take this opportunity to add a couple of my own questions that I was thinking about while you were talking today. One, I was really interested in the results around STEM occupations and the data that you presented. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about just sort of your speculation about the importance of showing STEM occupations in these shows versus what I think probably a lot of them are trying to do is more just to show like how science is relevant to kids in their everyday lives, and how do you balance that, regardless from this diversity perspective, like what are the goals of these shows and how do we think about those competing goals potentially?
Yes. Yeah, I love that question. And I guess I would argue that I don't think they need to be competing goals, right? I think that there are some shows who do both, where the central characters are doing that more sort of everyday play science, which is wonderful to model for kids, and then might have an interstitial in between two episodes where they, go out and talk to a real scientist and an engineer. And so, and of course, I understand that not every show can do that. What I should mention is we also coded pretend occupations, right? So a lot of playing pretend is such a big and important part of childhood, and important part that gets modeled in these shows. And so we were also coding for, even if it was a child just pretend playing a certain occupation. And we saw that happen a lot with pretend playing a shopkeeper and things that there has happened a lot in the shows, and just very unfrequently happened as sort of pretend playing the STEM occupation. So I think that is another area where they could be accomplishing both of those things, right? That sort of everyday play and exploration, but also mentioning perhaps occupations that kids might not be pretend playing at home yet until they see it modeled by their characters, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That makes sense. My other question, I think it's really like a two-part question maybe, but both about in some of the later stuff you were talking about sort of explicit versus implicit effects on children's racial development. And I know it's hard for 3 to 6-year-olds to sort of like verbalize some of those concepts, but how much do you think that, and are there ways to measure the extent to which some of these shows can be impacting kids on sort of a more implicit unconscious level, how they're thinking about their race as that develops over time? And then I think similarly, you mentioned having some of these themes and not as a central focus of the show or an episode, but sort of like displayed as the norm. And so how do we think about the importance of those sort of more implicit messages that we're sending in these shows about what is the norm in families and children's lives versus doing more of that explicit teaching, and our shows potentially trying to do too much if they're doing like explicit teaching of these cultural inclusion messages, but also teaching about STEM or some other concepts. Like, is there a risk of overloading on that explicit content? And how do we think about the explicit versus implicit messages that we're sending?
Yeah. That's such a great question. And I'm trying to think of how I might start answering it, but right, both are important. I think that's right. And you're right that certainly not every episode of every show can like explicitly tackle every problem. And I think that's where I'd really like to see things happening, is where we are seeing at least these conversations about diversity, different perspectives, equality, or equity, that they might occasionally, at least sometimes, happen as explicit conversations, but then also be sort of modeled in the background and implicitly. And so I should say certainly that what you were alluding to is really important, right? What children are, those implicit lessons and the implicit effects of media are the most difficult to sort of measure. And so I do think, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because in that study that I mentioned, where we sort of didn't see children necessarily improving in their science interest from the beginning to the end of the intervention, right? That's on their sort of explicitly measured interest. I think it is very possible that the intervention still had some implicit effects. And that's something that I think, research is still, we are continually developing more ways to measure implicit attitudes, but especially for young kids, it's quite difficult. And I think we really do need more sort of, long-term measures that can help us understand, perhaps over years of watching these shows, right? Maybe that's where we're seeing this sort of cumulative implicit effect. I think that was a sort of roundabout answer to your question, but hopefully got at a few of the ideas you were mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Aladé. This has been really a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate your sharing your research with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you all for being here in the audience. And this was great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for our attendees for joining us today as well. When you leave the meeting today, a very short survey will pop up. Please do fill that out if you're able to. We do value your feedback and use that to inform our future events. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.